My name is Shane Denson. I'll just get right to it. As if to fulfill Mary Shelley's fearful wish that her hideous progeny go forth and prosper, Frankenstein and his monster quickly took leave of the book and proliferated across the 19th century's changing media landscape. They appeared on mechanized theater stages and in political cartoons, mirroring the industrial era's defining reliance on techniques and technologies of serialized production. In the 20th century, these dynamics were amplified, of course, as Frankenstein became the subject of countless films that reanimated the monster as a self-reflexive emblem of filmic animation. In the process, Frankenstein became something like a second-order medium for staging and confronting the disorienting experience of media technological changes. In other words, for over a century now, Frankenstein films have been mediating situations of media crisis, or the experiential crisis faced by media users unaccustomed to a new medium or medial form. At such moments, when habituated media relations are disrupted by the shift from silent to sound film or from analog to digital media, for example, media may lose their transparency, call attention to themselves, and problematize the relations between perceiving subjects and mediated objects. In the case of Frankenstein films, the experience of media crisis is mediated serially by way of Frankenstein and, above all, the monster, who function as what I call serial figures. Such figures exist not within a series, but in fact as series themselves, as the expanding set of stagings or instantiations across media. The monster thus evolves not within a uniform diegetic or narrative space, but between or across such spaces of narration and visualization. As a serial figure, the monster leads a sort of surplus existence outside of any one given telling, thus placing it in a perfect position to reflect on the manner and the media of its repeated stagings. Serial figures move lightly and often between media in the course of their careers, undergoing significant transformations in the process. Frankenstein's monster is transformed from the highly articulate being depicted in Mary Shelley's novel to the mute monster of the movies. Not only is his narrative history, but his mediality is crucially at stake in the move to film. In James Whale's 1931 film, the monster becomes excessively visual, hyper-photographic, and this visuality is heightened by the monster's muteness. In this way, the film uses the monster to foreground the medium, including the still problematic image-sound relations of the early sound cinema, which it channels for the purposes of horror. So the monster's iconic image is, in a way, an index of media transformation, and it implies a medially self-reflexive dimension in which the monster's past lives as a literary, theatrical, or silent film figure are juxtaposed and contrasted with one another and with the figure's later reincarnations in radio, comics, TV, and video games. So this brings me to Frankenstein's post-literary function as a mediator of media change. As we've seen, the monster tends to problematize media to make them opaque as objects of interest in their own right. For example, the creation scene in any given Frankenstein film will typically be a display of cinematic as much as diegetic technologies of creation, designed to show off the state of the art in cinema's arsenal of techniques for animating or giving life to lifeless photographic images. The monster therefore oscillates between two frames of reference, the narrative frame of the diegesis and the extra-diegetic frame of a media historical and technological meta-narrative. And this oscillation resonates with the transitional phenomenological experience of the viewer in the context of a media crisis. On the basis of this correspondence, serial figures like the monster can initiate a sort of dialogue with the spectator on the subject of media change. They become mediators in the legal or paralegal sense of arbitrators who help media users to gauge and negotiate media changes and attendant experiential crises. Schematically, the monster vacillates between its diegetic expression and its extra-diegetic mediality, thus splitting attention between the narrative and the conditions of its medial framing. This corresponds to the split attention and figure ground reversals typical of the viewer's experience of media crisis and instability. The figure and the viewer are thus able to encounter one another at a middle altitude in an intermediate space where dialogue can take place on the historical and material conditions that give rise to media crisis. So take Thomas Edison's Frankenstein from 1910, which stands between the early image technology-oriented cinema of attractions, as Tom Gunning calls it, and the coming narrative-oriented classical Hollywood style. In 1910, the medium was in transition, torn between lowbrow technological spectacle and an uncertain reorientation along the lines of respectable theater. Accordingly, advertising for the film emphasized both, quote, the photographic marvel of the creation sequence and the story's origin in what they called Mrs. Shelley's work of art. The film aimed to be both technological spectacle and narrative high culture, and this multiple address informs the scope of the monster's mediating activities. The creation sequence's so-called marvel consists in footage of a burning mannequin projected in reverse, a simple bit of movie magic that in the context of early film served to exhibit cinematic technology by focusing attention on the filmic images rather than the objects that they depict. Frankenstein's reactions here channel the scopophilic pleasure of a primitive viewer for whom he stands in as a proxy. Importantly, animation here is a self-reflexive topos which links the monster's creation with the term animated photography, still common in 1910 as a description of film in general. However, the final showdown ambivalently signals a change of course towards narrative integration. The Edison Company claims that the scene communicates the story's moral, that love conquers all. But since the monster was identified with filmic technology in the creation sequence, Frankenstein's battle with the monster is also with the medium of film as an animating technology. The film's narrative closure is therefore mixed with a self-reflexive countercurrent. The mirror functions here like the projection surface of the cinema screen. The similarity is not merely abstract, but in fact visually perceptible due to the scene's technical means of production. The images in the mirror are themselves flickering filmic images. The result is a film within a film, and Frankenstein is again a film viewer. His battle with the monster is a battle with the images, and especially with the primitive type of reception that he exemplified in the creation sequence. But this time he's reformed, and instead of staring at the surface of the medium, he now acquires the ability to look through rather than at the mirror. In the context of the cinema's transitional phase, the film's narrative development is linked to a larger story of filmic development. Frankenstein's psychological maturation, which is consummated in the mirror scene, allegorizes a historical normative process of cinematic maturation and of spectatorial progress towards a proto-classical relation to film. But because monstrous self-reflection is essential to the staging of this normalizing meta-narrative, the allegory remains incomplete. The monster may have been conquered on the level of the diegesis, and indeed this defeat is structurally reproduced at the higher abstract level of the media historical meta-narrative. But the monster nevertheless survives at the medial level, at the level of mediation. For the film's supposedly integral narrative, whose closure Frankenstein achieves in overcoming his technology-oriented fascination, and therefore also the higher-order story of medial development that champions such closure and integrity, both of these narratives are in equal measure dependent upon the radical non-closure of the recursive self-reflexivity which the monster as mediator embodies. They depend, that is, on the monstrous in-betweenness that allows the figure of the monster to literally incorporate into the film much larger border conflicts between humans and their media. As a mediator, the monster channels the crisis situation of media change and ambivalently brings the stakes of a media historical turning point into view.